virtual, but like what's going to be in Europe now?
Well, I don't know. I'm supposed to take a group to Poland and I'm supposed to go in May.
You mean
Well,
Western Russia?
well, future. Look,
God forbid.
I'm not a political analyst, but I definitely think that what's going on in Ukraine is different than what could go on in Poland and the three Baltic countries. We visited Lithuania recently and Estonia and Latvia because they're all NATO members. So in principle, if Rasputin, or no, what's his name? If the Tsar, whatever, if the president decides to go
Rasputin.
and eviscerate the other countries, then NATO will respond not just by sending weapons and money, but also by defending. Oh,
I
is that
know.
me? Sorry, that's I got to put myself on.
Good morning, everyone. This is it's went so quickly, but this is our last session for now, virtually with Mike, with our last Jewish European Jewish journey, which we're going to Amsterdam. We need a little taste of Sephardic culture and Jews,
Okay,
you
we
know.
got that.
I know,
Yeah.
that's why I saved it for last.
But don't forget, Rabbi, in all the places we visited, I don't know. I think I've done 11. I know I've done 11 sessions, and I think I've done the bulk, if not all of them, with you folks at Wilshire Boulevard. And really, it was Spain. Spain was the only classic Sephardic site, and Amsterdam, as you said
Right.
today as well. But I do say, being that my last name is Hollander, and I'm not sure that I'm more pleased, and I'm not sure that I am. I mean, my father's father, who I never met, was born in London, or maybe Poland, we're not sure. But the family name Hollander, probably at some point we came from Holland,
Right.
which means, therefore, as you'll see soon, there's a very good chance that we came from Spain and Portugal,
Right.
which is the reason why at Pesach every single year the Hollander family has kitniot, has legumes. How can you live in Israel and not have hummus and
Right.
rice and corn on Pesach? So it's the majority in Israel, which is true, by the way. I mean, I know you've got a significant Persian community in LA, but there are more Ashkenazim, there are more Sephardim in Israel than there are Ashkenazim, even after the huge immigration from
From
the former
Russia.
Soviet Union.
You
Well,
know,
the former Soviet Union.
maybe we'll do another, series in the fall on like Middle Eastern Jewish countries, like Yemen and Morocco and Iraq.
Now you've got to get me to put my thinking hat on, Rabbi, because I've never been to these places. Up until now, I've only done sessions in places I've been to. People
Right.
have asked, "Oh, what about?" So there are places that I've done a lot of research on in the past year, like Salonika, the
Right.
tragic story of a Jewish community there, a Jewish community in not so much Paris, but in southern France, which is a place I may be going to next year with a group. So I just feel more comfortable taking you on a virtual journey to a place where I've been personally. I think it's a richer story because I have
Right.
more background. But we will put our thinking caps together.
Istanbul would be really interesting.
And that could be the Gulf, Manama.
I can give you like a little assignment, homework. And Pete, you can see Eric asked for more, and I'm sure other people would come for more because I feel so much more informed and interested and connected after listening to you.
Well,
So,
thank you, thank you, Rabbi. And I will say, as you know, many of you last week, I started guiding, and I'm starting a family on Friday and another family at the end of the month. So I'm back in things. But my wife said to me, "How did you have energy last week?" I did 4 lectures at night after guiding during the day. And there's something that I just, after 2 years of not being able to physically teach, in the field with people, I'm still energized by teaching online. So I'm glad you guys have been along for the ride. We'll do more. But in the meantime, let's go to what could be, I'm going to find you what could be your favorite or my favorite presentation, and that is Amsterdam. Amsterdam is, oh, wait a minute. It's March today. Oh, well, sorry. But we're close. Amsterdam, I'm sure many of you have been to. Oh, and Rabbi, at the end, if you have the data on the poll, maybe speak to Hannah in the meantime, the poll that we took into where people will be interested in going.
Hannah, can you get that for us by the end of the class?
Yes, unfortunately, not a lot of people chose to complete it. So there's only 5 answers.
Okay, so we're going to ask you today, just put it in the chat. We'll ask you to put it in the chat later because it's distracting. Between going to Budapest, Prague, and Berlin as one trip, or Spain as another trip, Spain and Portugal with an add-in of Portugal, or Morocco as a third trip, in what order are your interests? So it's Central Europe, Spain and Portugal, or Morocco, basically. So just please put it in the chat so we can know how to start to craft our plan for 2023. We're going to have a trip in May with Mike in 2023. It's just a matter of where you would like to go. The most people would like to go. Thank you very much. And now,
And it's not going to, thank you. We're in Amsterdam. I can almost guarantee you that of all the places we visited or traveled to together virtually, Amsterdam is the one where more of you have been than any other place. And so that was my challenge thematically in terms of what story I want to tell. And keep in mind, and you guys are, the committed 30 or so people, but it's not about the actual, walking around and seeing visual stuff. There's loads of videos online, and I always reiterate that. There's lots of stuff out there. But for me, the row houses, the beauty of Amsterdam, it's location in Europe. It's not in Eastern Europe. Linguistically, you can speak English and get along really, really, really well there. And the picture I have, the latest family picture, is my eldest son and his wife. I don't think they're married yet in this picture, but don't tell anybody. They were last in Amsterdam. I think it was their last trip before Corona. And today I drove him and his our youngest son, our number 3, who just finished the Air Force 2 months ago, to go snowboarding, I think somewhere in Italy. So hopefully they'll come back in a week or so. They're not going anywhere near Ukraine. I told them to stay on the trail. When did we get to Amsterdam? It's a question that is always asked. Amsterdam, in the Jewish community, there is known as Hamakom, or Makom, the place. Now, Hamakom is also the place of the temple in Jerusalem, right, where God resided, and sometimes is used as to reference God as well. It's as if God's hand led us there like a pillar of fire and smoke leading us throughout the desert, where we could finally feel safe. And we did for the majority of the 400 years that we were there. The picture of Jews doing business, in contrast to what we've seen in other places. The Jews doing business here, you can't tell who's Jewish and who's not, because there was no distinguishing marking ever forced on Jews when they lived in Amsterdam. The country of Holland, or the Netherlands, and they're used interchangeably, and I will admit I get very confused, even though I'm a Hollander. Today, the country of the Netherlands is made up of 12 provinces, states, and 2 of them are Upper and Lower Holland. You'll see that in a map in a minute. But the country that we're talking about forms in the 16th century as a rebellion against the Catholic King of Spain. Remember, it's the same century that Martin Luther comes onto the scene, the Reformation, massive changes. Tens of millions of people in the 16th and 17th centuries are killed in Europe over wars of religion, nothing to do with us, but they still blame this. Anyway, independent Dutch Republic forms, and one of its central tenets is the belief in freedom of individual conscience, of religion without persecution. Very similar to what happens 2 years later in America. Although I would argue that in 1776, there was a lot less freedom for people who weren't white Anglo-Saxon Protestants. But I digress. Dutch Protestants had a similar background to the Jews who fled the Inquisition, right? The Catholic persecution the Jews felt in the Iberian Peninsula. And the Jews who came into this new country brought with them a lot of familiarity with commercial empires into which the Dutch wanted to go, right, into West Africa, India, and Brazil in particular. And they had connections and spoke many of the languages in the Spanish Peninsula. By 1579, the new country, a year into it, had this decree of toleration. And shortly thereafter, Protestant, ready for this? Sorry. Jews who had converted to Catholicism went to Amsterdam in 1593 and reconverted to Judaism. We almost never hear the story. But for a century, Jews in the Iberian Peninsula, Marano you might call them, but Jews kept their Judaism secret. They were Catholic, outside at least, and then they came to this new free country, and hey, they reconverted. I don't know if they did a recircumcision, but that's another question. Anyway, they were given burghers' rights by members of the Portuguese nation already in the early years of the Netherlands.
Mike, there's something a little wrong with your sound. It's like going weird a bit. I don't know if you can adjust that. And for the last time, please talk a little slower.
Slow down. I'm sorry. Maybe if I slow down, then the sound might be readjusted. I can't think of anything else that's causing it in my room. Let me see if maybe over here, maybe I've got something else on Wi-Fi in my room. Yeah, let me turn that off. That might make a difference. Okay. 1598, we're allowed to build a synagogue, opens in the early 17th century. In many ways, I think the theme, if I were to pick one of the 400-year Jewish story in Amsterdam, is tolerance, tolerance, which was part of the DNA of this independent country. By the early 16th century, we are admitted officially, followed by a regulation allowing us to apply for non-hereditary citizenship. First time ever in Christian Europe, which is phenomenal when you think about 1600 years up to that point. There never were ghettos, forced distinction of Jewish race, as I mentioned. Maybe 1,000 Jews in the early 17th century in one area, which Rembrandt later lives on, the Street of the Jews, the Judenbriestadt, which ultimately the city becomes a magnet for Jews fleeing oppression across Europe, particularly in the 17th century. Two major events, the Khmelnytsky violence, which grows out of the Ukraine. Actually, this is a side, the last time I was in Moscow in November 2019, the group, we went on a subway tour. We've been there, and we saw this painting, this mosaic inside the beautiful mosaic, the subway there, a couple hundred stations, very artistic. And the local guide said, "Oh, that is the Ukrainian hero, nationalist hero, Bogdan Khmelnytsky." And he looked at the rabbi, conservative rabbi, and I said, "Did she just say Khmelnytsky?" And he said, "Yeah." And I said, "That's this Khmelnytsky of the mid-17th century, responsible for the biggest mass murder of Jews until the Holocaust. Somewhere between 1 to 200,000 Jews were killed." So big issue. Then it was followed by this period of false messianism, where some Jews thought that this meant the end was in sight, following this false Mashiach, Shabbatai Tzvi. The community grows by 1670, 50 years later, into a little close to 5,000 people, but Sephardim and Ashkenazim. Many of those Ashkenazim were those who fled persecution in German and Polish-speaking lands. And in 1675, the big synagogue that many of you have already visited, the Synagogue, is opened. And I'm quoting here from Simon Schama, the British Jewish historian, in his 2-volume book on the history of the Jews. For the first time in a Christian world, the Jews were not a glaringly alien presence, but just another micro-universe amid so many others. Mennonites, Lutherans, Catholics, because there was no institutionally supreme church in the Dutch Republic, right? There was no patriarchate or Vatican control as in other countries, nor an autocratic monarchy imposing allegiance around its dynasty. There was also no monolithic sense of Dutchness, against which Jews could be judged to be unassailably alien. Fascinating, and perhaps the Dutch example was followed later by America 2 centuries later. So the Jews, Schama continues, could actually lead a more openly religious life than Catholics, bizarrely, whose prayer houses had to be secret. For the Jews, this was the quietest kind of revolution. So the Protestant country was very much upset loggerheads with the Catholics, less so with the Jews, right? And we had a similar past of being persecuted by the Catholics. If we look at the golden age, 16th, 17th century of Holland, which was focused a lot on trade, you notice the trade routes from South America here, many of them coming into Amsterdam. And you'll notice the line, this map, as most of my maps are, borrowed from Martin Gilbert's History of the Jews in Maps. And Gilbert writes, within the 200 years of their expulsion from Spain, so really end of the 15th century, so let's say 1500 to 1700, the Jews who settled in Amsterdam had built up a trading empire on a scale previously unimaginable. Their success made an important contribution to the golden age of Dutch commercial enterprise. We talked about a golden age in Spain, mid-10th to the turn of the 12th, 13th century. We talked about the 16th century in Krakow, 16th century in Prague as well, but nothing like what happened in Amsterdam. And again, no previous history of persecution or ending a golden age by persecution. It is, I think, a fascinating chapter. I read a book just before Corona began on my way back from the States called The Coffee Trader. It's historic fiction, and it gives great insight into the debates, dilemmas, and challenges of Jewish traders, because the Jews played a very important part in the economic success of Amsterdam in that period, and they were involved in many fields: silk industry, tobacco, sugar, coffee, corals, and diamonds. And this is historic fiction about coffee, which begins to emerge as a worldwide commodity. We all need our cups of Java in the morning or in the afternoon or in the evening or whenever. And is only about a 300-400-year habit in most of the Western world. And in many of the countries I mentioned before, not only were we not forced to live in certain areas, but we were pretty much available to work in every sector: merchants, calligraphers, copper etchers, physicians, and bankers, of course. And because of this, secret Jews came from Spain, Portugal, others came from Italy, Germany, and Antwerp. The first Jewish printing press in Europe opened there, and it eventually becomes the printing press of the Judaic center of printing in Europe, right? A century before, it was the 16th century, the 1500s, the golden age of Jewish life in Europe was centered in places in Prague, really, and in Krakow. A century later, Amsterdam, in many ways, takes over. And what's fascinating is that the economic success of the Jews of Amsterdam ultimately led to the settling of the first Jews in the United States. It's a story that many of you are probably not familiar with. I was not until not that long ago, of Jewish immigrants who move from Europe to South America, Brazil, Curacao, Suriname, and eventually New Amsterdam, the first Jews to arrive in North America. There was a boat that set sail, in Recife, today's Brazil. It was occupied by the Dutch in 1630, but a quarter century later, the Portuguese took it and the Jews fled. 23 of the Jews set sail for Holland on a boat that ended up in New Amsterdam. Eric knows that well, New York City. The refugees hoped to settle there, and they would have religious freedom as they had in Holland, right? But what happens? The governor of New Amsterdam, Peter Stuyvesant, who you all heard of, there's some neighborhoods named after him, didn't want the Jews to enter his colony. He saw them as, quote, deceitful, very repugnant, and hateful and blasphemers of the name of Christ. He asked the directors of the Dutch West India Company, this first major international corporation, in which a number of the major shareholders were Jews, to deny entry to them, because he was there on their behalf, right? It was an attempt to colonize the world economically. Under immense financial pressure from many of the Jewish shareholders, Stuyvesant's request was rejected. The small but significant group of newcomers created the Shaarith Israel community. You can see a sign in New York. There is a synagogue on the Upper West Side, Central Park West, if I'm not mistaken, that is a Sephardic synagogue that I think is the later version of this, but 1656, this is a sign from the cemetery, first Jews, Sephardim in North America. We think of our ancestors maybe from German-speaking lands, coming to America in the 19th century or mid-19th, or from Eastern Europe, 1880 to 1914. But the first were Sephardim, a minority now, of course, but back then less so. And in a book that I used by, I forget her first name, Gerber in Spain, she describes the role of the Sephardic community in Holland. It earned a permanent place in Jewish history by nurturing, sheltering, and re-Judaizing the exiles from Spain, right? Those who reconverted when they came to Holland in the 16th century, as well as opening the gates for legal recognition of the rights of Jews to live in Europe as practicing Jews. Actually, did I write Europe? It should be America, but I apologize for that misquote. But it's amazing. The origins of the Jews in America today, the first community, are Jews from Holland. And it really gives a sense of this notion of freedom and liberties that took a couple centuries later till most of Europe recognized that. Here is Europe today, and I can't but not talk about the news. There is Ukraine in context of the size of Europe. It's the biggest country in Europe, even bigger than France and Spain. There is Mother Russia, which claims Ukraine is part of it. This is Belarus, Lithuania, and we talked in previous sessions, I think last week, we visited Vilnius, and I talked about the Pale of Settlement from the Baltic Sea up here down to the Black Sea. This is Crimea, by the way, and now under Russian control, should be part of Ukraine. But this whole area is where the bulk of Ashkenazi Jews, us, comes from, probably late 19th, early 20th century. There are the Netherlands, Holland, and to be more precise, as I mentioned before, here are the provinces of Holland, 12 of them. North Holland includes Amsterdam, and South Holland includes The Hague, the capital. So it's a country. We oftentimes, I think, refer to it as Holland, but ultimately it is the Netherlands, in plural, because it's made up of 12 provinces. The majority of Jews today, and for most of the story, have lived in Amsterdam. I'm going to introduce you to a few of them. The first one is Menasha Ben Israel. Where's his name? 17th century, very interesting guy, born in Portugal as Manuel Diaz Soeiro. I don't speak Spanish, but who knows? His parents fled the Inquisition, and they were Catholic on the outside, but right, they moved to Holland and they reconvert. He was a rabbi, mystic, diplomat, printer, lots and lots of different things. But what's fascinating is he opened the first Hebrew printing press. He didn't just do Hebrew printing, he did lots of other things. But he was, and this is again a quote from Simon Schama, he was the first publisher, printer of Hebrew and other languages, but he had, interesting enough, a reputation in Christian circles as the exemplary Jew, learned, humane, and sociable. Even the Catholics who knew him, like the bishop, who was in Amsterdam, called him a, quote, gentle-spirit, easygoing, reasonable. Fascinating. It takes another, what are we in the 17th? Another 150 years almost before Moses Mendelssohn comes into Berlin and is accepted in the intellectual circles of Europe at the time. He was a century before that already engaged in conversation with non-Jews. Shammah continues, even in the Dutch public, the liberal space for Jews to be themselves and yet also local patriots didn't open up easily, but it did happen. And in Holland, there were no ghettos, as I mentioned before, no invidious marks of dress. Inevitably, some called Amsterdam a New Jerusalem. Just like the three cities in the Rhine, the Schum cities, Speyer, Mainz, and Worms, the Amsterdam on the Rhine, at different times, when Jews have felt very comfortable in Spain as well, right? When they were exiled, they said it was as if we'd been exiled from Jerusalem. In golden ages, things are very comfortable for us there, and we refer to it as a Jerusalem, because we're not in the real Jerusalem. We don't have control of it, but that's how good it felt. This is his son, Samuel, and it's an etching by Rembrandt, who you'll meet in a few minutes. You all know him already, but very, very connected to the Jewish community. And it's a fascinating story about Samuel's father, Menashe, who meets a Portuguese Marano, secret Jew, who then tells him that the 10 lost tribes of Israel were in South America. Now, you might not remember, but in 586 BC, in 701 BC, the Assyrians destroy the northern kingdom of Israel. All that survives is the southern kingdom of Judah. 10 tribes are lost. We think the Jews from Ethiopia and Israel today are descendants of one of those tribes, the tribe of Dan. But here in the 17th century, this guy convinces Menasha Ben Israel that there are 10 tribes in South America. Ben Israel then publishes this book. Menasha Ben Israel publishes a book called The Hope of Israel. And he believes that Jews would return to England. They'd been expelled there since 1290 in order to fulfill, this is complicated, the pre-Messianic requirement of restoring Jews from the four corners of the world. Jews were not in England. Well, if you read Shakespeare, he probably met some Jews. That's how he wrote The Merchant of Venice. But officially they weren't there, and there was no organized community. But he manages to go to England, and he convinces Oliver Cromwell that the Jews should be allowed back into England. Why? Because Cromwell was a devout Protestant. And Menasha Ben Israel convinced Cromwell that there will never be a second coming of Christ. Because as we say in our prayers, right, Kibbutz Galuyot, from Arba Kanfot Haaretz, God will gather in the exiles from the four corners of the world. But Menasha Ben Israel was able to convince Cromwell that there's one corner in the world, England, where there are no Jews. And as a necessary precursor to the Messianic era, Jews had to be there. Crazy, twisted logic, but guess what? It works. And while he is there, 2 years he spends in London convincing Cromwell to allow the Jews back in. The student of Menasha Ben Israel, Baruch Spinoza, was excommunicated by the Amsterdam rabbis. So you might not have heard of Menasha Ben Israel, but you all have heard of Baruch Spinoza, one of the greatest Western philosophers. Here's a painting of, I don't think it's by Rembrandt, I think it's one of Rembrandt's students, if I'm not mistaken. Interesting guy, similar story, this time born in Amsterdam, to parents who fled Portugal, grew up in an Orthodox home until 17, and then he had to get a job in the family business. And in many ways, he was really the first person who publicly challenged the historical concept of God, God creating the world, right? And as a result, the rabbis in 1656, when he was all 23 years old, excommunicated Spinoza. Really, one of the earliest proponents of the Enlightenment, as well as biblical criticisms, because up until this point, the Bible in Jewish tradition, and as it still is in some circles in the Jewish world, is exactly divine word. There's no question of interpreting it. It happened as it happened, right? It rained and poured for 40 days. God created the earth in 6 days and rest. That's the way it was interpreted. He really was the first person to look rationally at the Bible, and later on, after he was excommunicated, became one of the main thinkers in the 17th, 18th century world of emerging philosophy in Europe. He was a lens grinder, and he probably died too young because he ingested a lot of the dust while he was grinding the lenses. Buried in a Protestant cemetery, but there's no evidence ever that he actually formally converted. But of course, he was excommunicated. And the great German philosopher Hegel said, the fact that Spinoza is made a testing point in modern, the fact is, that Spinoza has made a testing point in modern philosophy. So there may really well be said, you're either a Spinozist or not a philosopher at all. And, René Descartes, I think therefore I am. This whole concept of 17th century post-Reformation Europe goes through a massive change. And Spinoza is one of the first Jew, who challenges the traditional perspective of Jewish tradition, and as such is excommunicated. I put this up here so maybe the rabbi can cut and paste this if she needs this in any ritual ceremony. I'm kidding. But quite powerful text. Listen to the 1656 excommunication. The lords of the Ma'amad, the Jewish community, having long known of the evil opinions and acts of Baruch de Spinoza, have endeavored by various means and promises to turn him from his evil ways. But having failed to make him mend his wicked ways, and on the contrary, daily receiving more and more serious information about the abominable heresies which he practiced and taught, and about his monstrous deeds, and having for his numerous trustworthy witnesses who have deposed and borne witness to this effect in the presence of the said Spinoza, they became convinced of the truth of the matter, and after all of this has been investigated in the presence of the honorable Chachamim, they have decided, with their consent, that the said Spinoza should be excommunicated and expelled from the people of Israel. By the decree of the angels, by the command of the holy men, we excommunicate, this is harsh language, expel, curse, and damn Baruch Spinoza with the consent of God, blessed be he, and with the consent of the holy congregation in front of these holy scrolls. The Lord will not spare him. The anger and wrath of the Lord will rage against this man and bring upon him all the curses which are written in this book. And the Lord will blot out his name from under heaven, and the Lord will separate him to his injury from all the tribes of Israel. No one should communicate with him in speech or writing, nor accord him any favor. Pretty harsh. Not just that you're no longer a member of the tribe, Baruch, but nobody can have any contact with you whatsoever. Very radical to understand the significance of his challenging of the concept of God, quite simply. And his most famous book, Ethica, he describes, and I'm not a philosopher, so please don't, catch me in the philosophical details, but from my research, essentially, putting this piece together, and this is based on an article that appeared a decade ago or so in The Guardian, his most provocative idea is that God is not the creator of the world, but the world is part of God. It's just a different way of looking at it from the classic Genesis narrative that we grew up on. This is identified as pantheism, conflicts with both Judaism and Christian teaching. His originality lies in the nature of this distinction. God and the world are not two different entities, he argues, but two different aspects of a single reality. Many of us might agree with this, but back then, oh no. In his most famous book, he argues the way to blessedness or salvation for each person involves an expansion of the mind toward intuitive understanding of God and the whole nature of laws. Philosophy is like a spiritual practice whose goal is happiness and liberation. And when we look at Western civilization, in university you might have taken a course back in the beginning of the origins of Western civilization, and it was probably ancient Greece and ancient Rome, or maybe Mesopotamia and the Nile. But you look at the world, Martin Luther in the 16th century and the Reformation and the Enlightenment. And there were few Jews at the beginning because of the constrictions and restrictions of European Christian Europe. Few Jews were allowed into the process, and no question, Spinoza was one of the most important. Of course, the Dutch national hero, you can see from the 1972 banknote. A French philosopher referred to him as the Prince of Philosophers. Serious guy, even if he was excommunicated. And look at this. I found this online. It's I think a cover of a book, Benedictus, which is Latin for Baruch, right? Baruch, blessed. Benedict, as in benediction, or Benedict, the name of the Pope. Spinoza, Jew and atheist. Now, today, it's not uncommon for people to say, I'm a proud Jew, I'm a member of a synagogue, I live in Israel, etc., but I don't believe in God. You can't really say that. You couldn't say that back then, but he was the first one really to say, yes, a member of the Jewish faith, the Jewish community. I might not be, religious in that sense and believe in God, as in the Hebrew biblical story. Rembrandt, was he Jew and a hyphen-ish? Well, possibly. Probably not full-on Jewish, but very positive attitude toward Jewish people. And this is from online, the Jewish Virtual Library, describes how he lives in the Jewish quarter. It's been suggested that he chose to live here by its proximity to the city's growing Jewish community. Now, why? In fact, a few artists lived in the area. There's been much speculation as to whether Rembrandt and Spinoza knew each other. Who knows? But Rembrandt might have Spinoza's drawing teacher. That's been rejected. Many claim to see the likeness of Spinoza in paintings by Rembrandt, but there's a possibility that the two might have met at the home of Menasha Ben Israel, who on the one hand was one of Rembrandt's patrons, but on the other hand had been one of Spinoza's teachers until, when he was in London, Spinoza was excommunicated. Now, there are loads of Rembrandts you've seen in lots of museums, a few that I've been lucky enough to see, like this one in, how many of you will be lucky enough to see it, in the St. Petersburg Hermitage. And when I went there, the local guide said, this is the sacrifice of Isaac. And I said, no, it isn't. He said, what do you mean? He says, Rembrandt, right? Yeah, but it's not the sacrifice. What do you mean? He says, no sacrifice, because the angel said, cast not thy hand. It's the binding of Isaac in our tradition. But Rembrandt's art, of course, when, in Christian Europe, it's interpreted through a Christian prism. And so the Christian prism refers to this story in Genesis as the sacrifice of Isaac, as a precursor to God's choice of sacrificing his son, Jesus, in Jerusalem. So the binding of Isaac. Another one, that's me. It's called an old Jew. So I call it a middle-aged Jew and an old Jew, but that's another story. But loads and loads of Rembrandts there. This one is from the Rijksmuseum in Amsterdam. It's called Isaac and Rebecca, or the Jewish Bride, from sometime in the 1660s. And the story continues in terms of Rembrandt. It's fascinating because many of the writers in the 20th century, early writers, Zionist writers in Israel, referred to Rembrandt. Look at Bialik on National Poem. The Rembrandt wasn't Jewish. We must consider him as a Jew of honor for his love and empathy toward the Jews. Bialik writes in 1932. He continues, quote, this gifted genius has miraculously grasped and seized the core of the Hebrew soul like no other Gentile painter has ever succeeded to do. Appears in many other writings, Bialik, Agnon, Rav Kook even, and Ephraim Kishon, the humoristic comedian. And it's fascinating because if you look at European art, a lot of it is biblical. And a lot of the biblical art is either that of Jesus and Mary and the disciples, or biblical, or they call Old Testament stories that are precursors of or connected to Jesus. This is not to do with Jesus. It's a Jewish couple getting married. And Rembrandt really, unless somebody just can prove me wrong or tell me or teach me otherwise, the first major artist to really celebrate Jewish life in a positive rather than in a negative light. And Rembrandt, many historians believe, thought that the Jews that he knew in Amsterdam were actual descendants of those in the Bible, and he oftentimes used his friends as models. For example, this is a picture that is in the Israel Museum, one of my favorite pieces in the Israel Museum. It is a painting called Peter in Prison. You can see it over here on the left-hand side, 1631. That's Peter. You can see the keys to heaven there. And on the right is a painting that is in Amsterdam. It's called Jeremiah Lamenting the Destruction of Jerusalem. It's hard to see. It was on loan a few years ago to the Israel Museum, and they put them side to side. And you look really closely and say, wait, it looks like the same model. And it's quite probable that model was maybe an old Jew in Amsterdam who Rembrandt knew quite well, or he paid him to be the person in those major portraits. Long text, don't read all of it, but if we look at the 16th century, the Dutch Golden Age, was in the 17th century. They founded the Dutch East India Company. Lots of immigrants coming from Spanish countries into Holland and Belgium as well. It really was the finest hour of Jews in all of Amsterdam, and they went from various expelled areas or areas of persecution into Amsterdam. It allowed us to rediscover our Jewish identity, burst of cultural prosperity, rich intellectual life, and as I said, referred to as New Jerusalem. Every other community I've talked to pretty much, I talk about this accordion of good times and bad times, welcomed in, persecuted, kicked out, brought back in, higher taxes, persecuted, kicked out. This accordion, it never happens in Holland. It's this growth in the community with positive energy and positive Jewish as well as non-Jewish creativity. I mean, the Jews were creative in the Jewish context, but also in the larger world. All the individuals were friends, many were friends of Rembrandt, as I said before. In fact, one of them, Ephraim Bueno, was his personal physician, is considered to be one of Rembrandt's finest paintings. Here's an etching of his friend the doctor from 1647. And the amazing thing, of course, when you see these is you can't tell that Dr. Ephraim Bueno was Jewish. Every other contemporary image, almost, of European art showed the Jew in a different light. Negative, and to have a contemporary Jew in a painting? Come on, seriously, guys? That was Rembrandt. Rembrandt went to the length of actually writing in Hebrew, right? The 10 Commandments up over there. Moses destroying the 10 tablets, and pretty good. Maybe he had a Jewish guy write the actual letters over there. Here's the painting of his friend Dr. Bueno from 1647. Looks just like a Dutchman, every other Dutchman. What's amazing is that when Rembrandt buys this house, very nice house in the Jewish neighborhood, the question historians ask is, why would a Christian want to settle in the area of the Jews who killed Jesus? Maybe he was Jewish? Probably not. It already was an artist area, but he was very, as I said, enamored with Jews, loved biblical scenes, and was not a philo-Semite, but really was authentically friendly with Jews. Look at the number of paintings and drawings of Jews. This is from the Philadelphia Art Museum, portrait of a young Jew. No negative connotations whatsoever in the art. Look at the Jews in the Synagogue, an etching from 1648 that's in Amsterdam as well. All right, so Rembrandt, fascinating. And if you want to kind of understand the emergence of 400-year Jewish community in Amsterdam, this is the founding generations in the 1700s with Rembrandt, where Jews are seen in a very positive light by the larger society. And it's in that context that 3 Sephardic communities merged together by 1639. By 1672, they begin building this monumental structure. If you've been to Amsterdam, you've seen it, called the Synagogue, which literally means synagogue in Ladino, the language spoken by the Portuguese immigrants. And kind of like, I don't know, let's say, I'll pick a random city, Los Angeles. Let's say random synagogue, temple. No, let's say Wilshire Boulevard Temple. You don't build a beautiful structure, a new structure in 2022 that you just inaugurated, or 2021, in a prominent place in the city, unless a number of factors are in play. One is you have the means to do so. 2 is you feel comfortable enough to do so. And you're making a statement to the rest of the community. We are part of the landscape, physically and culturally. And so were the Jews in Amsterdam in 1675. Most of the monumental synagogues that we have seen in our journeys together in Europe are not from the 17th century. They're much later, right? The latter half of the 19th century. Think the Johanni in Budapest, Oranienburger Strasse Synagogue in Berlin, right? 1,000 candles could light it if possible. And later synagogues, most prominently the one in Bevis Marks in London, are modeled after this synagogue. A couple paintings and etchings that I found online when I was putting this together by Dutch artists, De Witt on the right over here, De Hoog on the left over here, to give you a sense of it wasn't just a place where Jews were worshiping, it was a place where the locals were very proud of the structure. And look at the picture that's up here. I've cut it. You'll see the next slide a little bit bigger, right? You see where it says temple up there? Look at the next slide. There it is. Temple of the Jews in Amsterdam. There's the symbol of triple X of Amsterdam. There is the law being given. Very, 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 very different than classic Christian interpretation of the Jewish story, right? This is an artist putting this up. It wasn't part of the synagogue. Go back here, right? I mean, this is the synagogue. This wasn't on the roof, but they added it to the painting to give you a sense of how tolerant it was. And look at this other painting. Later on, you can see this image up over here, right? There's the temple in Jerusalem. There's an outside view of the synagogue, and here it is the monumental synagogue. But I've drawn a blow up on this as well. And I don't know if you can see, but there I've circled over here. Can you see that? It's blurry from the internet, but it says in Latin, translating in English, freedom of conscience is the mainspring of the Republic. Here you see the Jewish Bible being read by Jews. In other words, we are very proud of the fact that freedom of conscience is a very important part, the mainspring of the Republic of the Netherlands. And the Jews, as I say, were a very important part and felt very comfortable in that. Contrast these Christian artistic renditions, right? Go back one slide if I can. Right? This is the image of the synagogue and all sorts of quotes here. And this is the thing on top that I've just highlighted again. Contrast this art made by Christian artists to what you might have seen at the Cathedral in Worms, or here I took pictures a few years ago. My wife and I were in France, in Paris, outside of Notre Dame before the fire. And what do you see on the left as you enter the church, as Christians have for hundreds of years? Two images. On the left is Ecclesia, or the church. There she is, her crown on her head, and her chalice in her wrist and her hand, and her scepter standing high. And on the other side, you see Synagogue. She is humiliated. She's hunched over. Her scepter is broken. Her old covenant, the Old Testament, the Hebrew Bible is passé. There's a new covenant. There's a new book to be found, ladies and gentlemen. Her eyes are blind because she cannot see the reality of Jesus as the Messiah. This is the way Jews were portrayed in Christian art for the better part of 2,000 years in Europe. And the story of Amsterdam is fundamentally different. In other words, they were loyal to that notion, as I said, that that freedom of conscience is the mainspring of the Republic. So nothing to do with Amsterdam, those pictures, but I wanted them up there. Two synagogues I mentioned. I've been in. I lived in London for 3 years, the beautiful Bevis Mark Synagogue. It's right in the center of the city, the financial district of London, still a functioning Sephardic synagogue. It was the synagogue of Moses Montefiore and a guy named Benjamin Disraeli. You might have heard of him. He, when he was bar mitzvahed, his father had a bit of a row with the synagogue and he left and his son was baptized. His son later becomes Benjamin Disraeli, of course. And on the right-hand side is a synagogue called the Tzedek V'Shalom Synagogue from South America, Suriname, that about 15 years ago was taken down piece by piece and brought to the Israel Museum and reassembled in the Israel Museum because there are no Jews really left. There are not enough Jews to maintain this beautiful synagogue. But you see the arcs very, very much inspired, as if the synagogue, the Portuguese synagogue in Amsterdam, was this paradigm that was then copied, emulated by Sephardic communities all over the world. More pictures of the, it's phenomenal in that it wasn't destroyed in the Holocaust and it's still there and it's still functioning. So I love it. And most people who go to Amsterdam, that's one of the main sites that they see. The House of Anne Frank, the museums, and of course the synagogue. 1796, we were finally given full rights, but there were two separate Ashkenazi and Sephardic communities. I mean, within the umbrella, but with their different traditions. Fast forward a while, because nothing of enormous significance. There's no real change. Most of Europe, we talk about the 1800s as the time of great change, but it already happened before that. By the 1930s, 40% of Jews were married to non-Jews, similar to Jews in America today, which again is a metric to show how comfortable the Jews felt in the larger community. Dutch immigration, Dutch welcomed Jews from Germany, over 30,000 by 1940, fleeing Nazism. And by the time the Nazis occupy Holland, there are about 140,000 Jews, about 100,000+ originally from Holland, and as I said, the remainder coming from Germany. More images with its beautiful wooden floor, by the way, and the chandeliers in the synagogue are similar to those in the Bevis Marks and in the Tzedek, the synagogue from Suriname in Israel now. When the Germans occupy Holland in the spring of 1940, Hitler creates a civilian, not a military occupation, different than France and Belgium. All Jews are forced to register, and business is liquidated, and they do. They're law-abiding citizens, right? It's not like what happens in Germany from 33 to 40, Poland even in the midst of a war. It's a war, but the reality in Holland is different. Jews register, and to this date, Yad Vashem has names of the 98 transports with 101,000 Jews who were ultimately sent out between 42 and 1944. Police, together with Dutch police and Germans, I should say, searched for Jews, but there were lots of Jews who were hidden. By January 42, all Jews, that many outside of the city, had to relocate into Amsterdam. And in the fall of 42, Jews began to be transported to the death camps of Auschwitz-Birkenau and Sobibor through the Westerbork camp. And as I said, over 100,000 Jews were killed in that period, slightly over 2 years. You all know the story, the Diary of Anne Frank, of course. I can't do a presentation on Amsterdam without the Diary of Anne Frank. And here's a picture of her in school before she had to go into hiding. And this is a diary entry just before she goes into hiding in the summer of 42. After May of 1940, the good times were few and far between. First there was the war, then the capitulation, and the arrival of the Germans, which is when the trouble started for the Jews. Our freedom was severely restricted by a series of anti-Jewish decrees. Jews were required to wear a yellow star, required to turn their bicycles, forbidden to use streetcars, forbidden to visit Christians in their homes, required to attend Jewish schools, etc. You couldn't do this and you couldn't do that. So this is an entry just before, as I said, they went into hiding. And you can see another image, because I love them and I found too many of them on the internet. When they have a special occasion, looks like a wedding, they light up the synagogue with candles. Quite dangerous because it is a wooden floor. But besides the story of Anne Frank, I want to share stories of other righteous amongst the nations, because Holland, the image of Anne, of course, and the secret bookcase in the annex where she hid. It's interesting because at the beginning, the anti-Jewish policies didn't meet much Dutch resistance, but in February of 1941, there were hundreds of Jews, young men, who were arrested. There was a major protest that started. There were lots and lots of Jews hidden, particularly children. And what's fascinating about the Dutch story is that there are many Catholic and Protestant clergy who were involved in the rescue and actually spoke out against the anti-Jewish policies. By September 44, the southern part of Holland was liberated, but it takes until the spring of pretty much the end of the war until all of Holland is liberated. And out of a community of 140,000, 25,000 Jews were hidden. That's about, 20%, 1/5 at least. That is a huge number. At the same time, the percentage of Jews killed in the Netherlands is higher than any other Western European country, because most countries were Eastern European. But as I mentioned before, huge numbers were killed. But it also has, most importantly, to me at least, the largest percentage of righteous amongst the nations. People who risked their lives in order to save a fellow Jew. Yad Vashem, the Holocaust Museum in Jerusalem, a national memorial in Israel, issues a certificate and issues a medal, and sometimes even a pension to a person who risks their life, if only to save one Jew. We've met in previous sessions Karl Lutz, the Swiss consul in Budapest. You know the story of, or we heard just a couple weeks ago, Sugihara, the Japanese consul in Lithuania, in Kaunas, just outside of Vilnius. But I want to share a couple of stories, including this one of a woman I'd never heard of until about 20 years ago. I was guiding a Protestant group from Tennessee, and they said, we go to Yad Vashem, Mike, we want to see the tree planted in honor of this woman, Corrie Temboom, and her family. I never heard of Corrie, but there is this sign outside of the tree, and Corrie Temboom, her father. Devout Christian family and sister. And they help rescue up to 800 Jews. As she writes in the book, in this household, God's people are always welcome. The family added an extra bedroom where they could hide 6 people. So it was kind of a halfway. So people came to them, they hid for a few days, and then they took them out and hid them even further, took them out of the country. Eventually, all 3 were captured. Her father and sister died in captivity, but she managed to survive solitary confinement and lived to tell the story and wrote the book. Now, if you do the math, 800 people survived. That's in 1942 to 1945. How many descendants those 800 people have? 10 each, 50 each, if they became more, it's crazy. Person most of us have never heard of, responsible for saving the lives of hundreds of people then, who have thousands of descendants. Of course, people do not go to Amsterdam without going to the Anne Frank house. The story of the Franks, they come from Frankfurt. By the way, the mother, Edith, her maiden name is Hollander. Not that I know I'm related at all in any way, shape, or form. But Margot, the older sister, receives her call up to work. And then the father decides, that's it. We're going to hide in the secret annex that he and his non-Christian colleagues have prepared in the backspace of the Prinsen Gracht office space. And they hide from July 42. They're joined by others, the Van Pelts and Fritz Pfeffer. For more than 2 years, they hid until they were discovered in August. They were all sent to Westerbork and other camps, but only the father survived. And we know from testimony that Anne died in Bergen-Belsen not too far before the end of the war. What's amazing is that her diary, published within a few years after the war, has been sold in over 30 million copies in 70 languages. In many ways, her story is the universal story of the Shoah, but I'm going to come back to that 2 slides. And the last the last entry, I believe, from her diary, from one of the last entries. One day this terrible war will be over. The time will come we'll be able again. It will be people again, and not just Jews. We can never be just Dutch or just English or whatever. We will always be Jews as well. And then we'll have to keep on being Jews. But then we'll want to be. And I think of her optimism even after 2 years in hiding. And of course, when I read this today, I think about what's going on in Ukraine. Not that far from where I'm talking to you, 44 million people. How many, 500,000 refugees, 200,000 Jews looking for homes. Big, big challenges that unfortunately have not changed since 1942-44. Here is the line. Today you need a ticket to get into the Anne Frank Museum. If you do plan on going, do it as soon as you have your dates, because it's really hard to get into and it's small. This is the office. This was the factory of Otto Frank, his business, and they had in the secret annex. All of these buildings now belong to the Anne Frank Foundation, but this is actually the annex itself. And here's a reconstruction of the bookcase who have not been there, for those who have not been there. Insight into the significance of Anne Frank. One of my first childhood memories of Jewish history in Europe and the Holocaust is, of course, reading the diary, and of course, watching the movie or seeing the play. And in many ways, I think as parents or grandparents, when you want to introduce young children to the tragedy of the Shoah, it's a good place to start, because there's no violence in there, right? It's the story of leading up to going into the hiding place. And in many ways, a lot of people are actually perplexed by the success of the Diary of Anne Frank, including this young boy. His name was Lolik Lau, who is the youngest survivor of Buchenwald concentration camp. There he is today. He was the chief rabbi of Israel, Rav Meir Lau. His son, Benny Lau, is today's chief Ashkenazi rabbi of Israel. And listen to what he writes. At 8 years old, I was the youngest survivor of Buchenwald. When I was 10, I picked up the Diary of Anne Frank. I wanted to see what everybody was talking about. I was astonished. That's all? The whole book is not to be compared to one day in Buchenwald. Where's the concentration camp, the torture, the killings? I couldn't understand why people were so excited about this book. He lived through hell, and he reads this book, and it's like, it's a tragic story, but this family hiding in, you can't let the water down or flush the toilet, or it gets too hot, or you can't, right? That's not what he experienced. When I got older, he continued, I realized that the book's success lay in the fact that it didn't speak about millions. It was one person's story, with one human being you can identify. And I always say, when I talk about and I teach about the Shoah, the question is, we know the Diary of Anne Frank, but there's still 6 million diaries that we will never find out about. And if we don't find out about those other 6 million, then we have to cling to the one that we do know about and read that story or the other stories of survivors that we know about as well. And from that, multiply it by the thousands and the tens of thousands and the hundreds of thousands to get the enormous figure of 6 million victims. I put this slide up earlier this week because there was this article, which you might have seen. It was in February in the Times of Israel. It's this book. I haven't read it. I'm not an expert on it, but I knew that some people might ask me about that. Who betrayed the Frank family? And so quotes from the article as follows. The results were, quote, extremely speculative and sensationalist, the Jewish community of Amsterdam said. There is no smoking gun or hard evidence. The findings are mainly based on one note written after the war. The Jewish council member, Arnold Vanderberg, who, according to the sleuths who put this book together, died in 1950, quote, and cannot defend himself. The investigation would never stand up in a court of law. Jewish organizations have asked the book be removed from bookshelves. The foundation president told Swiss Daily that the findings bordered on a conspiracy theory. So I don't know the truth, but what's the purpose of this? Is it, as Mayor Lau said, it allows us to understand the story of one person? Are we focusing on the craziness of who ratted on the Frank family or whatever? Or are we focusing on the tragedy of one individual and her family, and from that, understanding the enormity of the Shoah? One of the most important stops I make with groups in Amsterdam is here. You can see the statue of a dock worker, 1941, in front of the big Ashkenazi Synagogue behind it. And it tells the story of the heroic protests of up to 200,000 people who participated in the early months of 1941, when 400 Jews were ordered out to be transported. The dock workers and municipal workers said, we're going to strike and protest. Posters went up all around the city, trams stopped, companies closed. The Nazis forcibly stopped the protest. A few people were killed. They removed the mayor, but it's the largest protest of any Nazi policy in Europe in all those years of Nazi occupation. A year later, 2 years later, it stopped the Nazis from deporting the Jews, unfortunately. And as I mentioned, the memorial is next to the Synagogue. Here's some pictures online from that very powerful protest with the Jews being arrested here, and you can see the calls of strike, strike, strike in Dutch. And two other pictures from the theater, which today is the Holocaust Memorial. This was the rounding up station from where Jews would gather and then would be sent out to Westerbork. And here's the protest. I mean, this is not a small little protest. You know, I'm optimistic when I see what's happening in Russia, and it's actually getting through. There are 1,000 people. There's a video of people walking on the main street in St. Petersburg today protesting the war. That's good news. This is incredible, the number of people involved. Even as they were already into the brutality of the Nazi occupation, already for almost a year from May of 1940. Where is that memorial situated? There it is. Further perspective, there is the synagogue and the Jewish culture and the Jewish institutions all around it. So very, very prime place in Amsterdam, a very important part of the story. And nearby is the memorial, the Schouwburg Theater. I showed you a picture before, which had been a national theater. It was the assembly place from 42 to 43. 19 years later, it was demolished except for the facade, which a year later opened as a memorial. There it is on the inside of it. There's an eternal flame, and on the walls on the left here, and the walls on the right over there, are names of the 6,700 family names of more than 100,000 Jews who were murdered. So there's a memorial there. There's also a Jewish historical museum, which is comprised of the four Ashkenazi Synagogues. It's literally across the street from the Synagogue. And Ashkenazi Synagogues, you know, why do you have four next to each other when, well, one you're a member of and the other two you're never going to set foot in or whatever? But in the late 80s, it opened as a museum. One explores the history of Jews from the 19th century, another from the arrival of the Jews until 1900. Another one is a children's museum, and another one I think is actually used as a shul, kind of to go through the history there. And in addition to the Jewish sites that one sees, and the great thing about Amsterdam, of course, is everything is very, very, very close. You have to go to the National Museum. Lots of Rembrandts, lots of other Dutch artists, including Vermeer. And again, this is not a session on art appreciation. I put in Rembrandt because he's a very particular artist who had a very deep connection to the Jewish community, unlike any other artist, I think, across Europe. And through his art, we're able to really understand the nature of the relationship of Jews to the larger society and vice versa, right? Unlike any other European artist until maybe even the modern era, non-Jewish. I'm not talking Chagall, but 1600s Rembrandt. Vermeer, contemporary to more or less to Rembrandt, beautiful art, but very little Jewish in terms of Vermeer's art. Here you see the classic milkmaid. And you know, there's some great paintings there, including the, what's this called? The Watchman, I think it's called. Yes, I forget the name. Somebody correct me. But the Watchman in the Night Watch? No, it's Night Watch. The Night Watch, sorry, in the Rijksmuseum, recently redone. I haven't seen it since it's been redone. But people make pilgrimages, you know, to Madrid, not just to see the Prado Art Museum, but across the street to see the Reina Sofia Museum, where they see Picasso's Guernica. This is possibly the most famous of Rembrandt's painting. Nothing Jewish, but you know, if you look at the Jews in the previous pictures, his Dr. Bueno, Fran Bueno, looks just like all these other Dutch noblemen. So again, the Jews were an important part, not discriminated against in the landscape in the 17th century in Holland. And the other great museum that you will see there is probably the Van Gogh Museum. Jewish Van Gogh? Who knew? Well, when I was putting this together in October of last year, and I love Van Gogh, and I've been fortunate enough in recent years to see a lot of Van Gogh, and you'll see some of the paintings I've taken, pictures I've taken in museums. There was the Van Gogh, opened in the 70s, the biggest collection in the world, right? We go to some great museums. I haven't been to LA, but the what is it, LACME Museum, I guess, or the Chicago Art Institute, or the Metropolitan Museum, and the MoMA in New York, in Jerusalem. There are a couple of Van Goghs, but more here than anywhere else in the world. And look at these quotes in this article from October by a professor at Boston University named, you'll see in a moment, Charles Delheim. The process of commercializing Van Gogh started 120 years ago, early 20th century, when German Jewish art collector Paul Cassirer staged the first showing of the Dutch painter's works in Berlin. After that, Van Gogh's legacy and modern art in general became intertwined with the trajectory of European Jews, according to historian Charles Delheim. Think, we talked about the Gustav Klimt and his group of artists in the Secessionist school in the late 19th, early 20th century in Vienna, and the Jewish support of the art world in Vienna in the Ringstrasse, late 19th, early 20th century. So too with Van Gogh. And if we think today in terms of art in America, right, the patronage of Jewish philanthropists in supporting the world of art, it probably wouldn't exist as well if it would have as much Jewish support of it, and goes back already to Van Gogh. Amongst the modernist painters adored by Jewish collectors, Van Gogh figured prominently. Within 2 decades of his death, a good deal of the paintings and drawings had been purchased by Jewish collectors. So who knew? I discovered when I was putting this together that Van Gogh, very few Jewish subjects, although this one I found, a bookseller from 1882, doesn't look Jewish, doesn't have a kippah on, he doesn't have a hat on, but it's called the Jewish Bookseller, right? So Jews in Holland, Starry Night, I took a picture of a few years ago when I was in New York at the MoMA Museum of Modern Art, of course. How can you miss it? That's why it's a bad picture, because it's from my phone. Of course, sunflowers. Of course, his own. I mean, just the amazing works of Van Gogh, I think, to me at least, is one of my favorite artists. I'm not that into art, mind you, but very different because in many ways, I think Van Gogh is one of the best symbols of the transition from traditional Christian European art to modern art, that whole era of Impressionism and later, of course. And I want to end with lots of color and lots of positive. I want to end with this beautiful image from the internet of the canals in Amsterdam to say that of all the places we have visited together in the past year and a half virtually, there's no question in my mind that the story of Amsterdam, the 4 centuries of Jewish life, when Jews were allowed into this very tolerant and open society, is fundamentally different than most of the other places that we visited. That being said, all the other places we visited had some pretty darn good periods of Jewish success, Jewish comfort, and Jewish creativity. Unfortunately, most of them were followed by periods of persecution, periods of violence, periods of expulsion, and then again followed by periods of being brought in. But Amsterdam is fundamentally different. The Jewish story in Amsterdam today, it is still there. There is a Jewish community. There's actually a significant Reform community in Amsterdam, more than in probably every other country that we've touched in our sessions today. But it's a positive story of 400 years of quite comfortable Jewish living, in many ways overshadowed by that very short, dark period of May 1940 until May 1945 under the Nazi occupation. But even that darkness, I think, should be enlightened by the story of so many righteous amongst the nations. If they saved one, think about it. Poland, 10% of the Jewish community survived. In Holland, what did I say? 25,000, 101,000 of 140,000 were killed, but a significant number, 25 to 35,000, were saved because they were hidden by their fellow countrymen. And with that, I turn over to you, Rabbi. If we have any questions, I see some in the chat. And I'll be happy to address them.
How many Jews in Holland today? Do we know?
It's a good question. I don't know. I can look on the internet. I'm guessing somewhere in the area of 25 to 35,000.
Not so many.
Not so many.
So did they leave or did they intermarry? Is there a lot of intermarriage there?
There is intermarriage. There's significant. There are those who have left. There's not an insignificant Jewish community in Holland today. But the Jews in Holland were as comfortable, I think, 1930, 1940, as Jews in Berlin were until Jews in Berlin were until 1933. It really was a place where people felt very, very much at home. As the first slide said, Hamakom, the place. This is the place where we're comfortable and we are tolerated.
I just want to, before we open up the chat, I don't know if you know this book by Dara Horn. It's a new book called People Love Dead Jews. We had her speak, and she talked about how inevitably, she's a Jewish writer. She's written on many topics, and like the Smithsonian or the Wall Street Journal, the New York Times would inevitably say, write about Anne Frank. And she said it's because they loved or they cherished the idea of this martyr, this girl who died, but people don't like living Jews that much, is what she found. There's anti-Semitism and there's a romanticism, if that's the weird word, around martyred or murdered Jews from the Holocaust. So it was a real dichotomy.
No question. Well, I thank you for that. I just read her book, and I mean, I remember reading the piece on Anne Frank as well. But one of the things that I endeavor to do in my sessions is, and you might not remember this, one of the first sessions, that might have been the first one I did on Poland. I talk about that triangle, a prism through which to understand when I guide groups there or when I do it virtually, the Jewish experience in Europe. And I talk about this three-sided prism, 1,000 years in Poland or 400 years in Holland of Jewish life, good, bad, and everything in between. Right. The short period of the Shoah and the period after the Shoah. And I think that it's very easy for us as Jews as well to say that much of our experience, and my grandmothers, I never met my grandfathers. My grandmother said the exact same thing when I was growing up in the 60s and 70s. Oh, Europe, it was bad. Well, it wasn't always bad. There were some pretty good times, and we are descendants of the positive creativity of Jewish life in that continent for 1,000 years, in spite of all the bad stuff that went on, But as I said, Holland is an exception to that. And that's why when I travel, it's so easy. Why do you want to go to Poland? I have to say Kaddish at Auschwitz. Well, I want you to understand what Jewish life was and why we're actually saying Kaddish. It's like when you say Kaddish for a relative, you're ideally, unfortunately, you're reflecting on the legacy of that flame that has been extinguished. So just to say Kaddish, to go to the ritual without understanding the significance of it, I think is in many ways a double tragedy, in that the Jews were murdered and that we're not giving enough time, space, and kavod and honor to the life that they live, right? In many ways, we do kind of what Darrell Horn said. We Jews, it's easier for us to understand Jewish death than it is to understand Jewish life. And part of my challenge in putting these presentations together was to find those pieces of Jewish life. And a lot of times, I ultimately focused on individuals and their story, whether it was Spinoza, whether it was Menasha Ben Israel, whether it was a non-Jew Rembrandt, to understand, through those life stories to get into the bigger Jewish story. With that being said, I checked online, Rabbi, 29,000 Jews in the Netherlands. That was not that inaccurate.
So I don't see any questions. I see nice comments. Do you see questions?
Central Synagogue. Oh, here was some requests. Hello, good morning. I don't see any other. Please include 2 Goodmans when you're planning.
We'll include you all, anybody who wants to go. And you have just brought Europe and Jewish Europe so alive to us. And we can't wait to be alive with you and go and travel. I mean, we're planning to do 3 trips with you, ideally, 23, 24, 25. And wow. God willing, everything works out for us. And if you are inclined to create some presentations about, Mizrahi Jews, we would definitely be interested.
Well, I hope there won't be another Corona, but one of the things that, I keep saying, and I don't know how many of you have been in the situation, and I will say that in the past 2 years for me personally, my kids are all, and I keep talking about my kids, but my eldest is he's his own contracting business. He hasn't stopped for a day of work in 2 years, even in Corona. My daughter has been studying at university for 2 years. She hasn't stopped for 2 years. She's done stuff on Zoom. My son was in the Air Force, and most of our friends are, the doctors and the lawyers and the psychologists. They're doing what they've been doing. And me and my colleagues have been, grappling with our real sense of meaning and purpose. And what we love doing, our passion, is traveling and learning, as I always say, learning not just about the places that we go to, but I think learning about ourselves as well. And I really thank you, Rabbi, for never having met you. I don't know how many of you realize this, but the shidduch was done with Jody way back when, in September of Corona of 2020, when she was putting up what the synagogue was doing to prepare for streaming services. And like, wow, that looks crazy. And she says, hey, nobody does it like Wilshire Boulevard. She says, what are you doing? And I said, well, I'm doing some online teaching. She says, oh, let me connect you over to Rabbi Susan Annis. And for those of you who don't know, Rabbi Susan and Mike have never physically met. But I really want to thank you, Susan, because you've given me an opportunity to A, meet new people, B, tell some more stories, and keep people, I think, hopeful that we're kind of reaching a new era at the end of Corona, and that we won't just have to talk about these places, but I really think that there's a much deeper level of meaning when you walk around the places and experience them and kind of ask yourselves, whoa, what was going on here 80 years ago, 180 years ago, and 280 years ago? So I really thank you for that opportunity. And I know we'll be traveling together multiple times in Europe or elsewhere in the not too distant future.
So thank you so much. I'm going to say goodbye and lehitraot. We'll see you soon.
Indeed. All right. Take care. Be safe. Be good. Be healthy.
Bye.